Okay, happy Earth Day to everybody and a very, very warm welcome to this Climate Justice Charter Movement Earth Day Assembly. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Vishwas Satka. I'm an activist in the Climate Justice Charter Movement. When we think about Earth, one of the things that we need to think about is the first sort of view of Earth from space. And this view was shared with us by astronauts, particularly in the 60s. When they looked away from Earth, they saw darkness, they saw a lifeless kind of galaxy around them. But when they cast their gaze towards Earth, they saw a place in which life thrived. And that's the beauty of our planet. It has a small envelope called the biosphere, in which all forms of life exist. Human, non-human, big and small, ecosystems, within ecosystems, within an Earth system. And that's one of the sort of defining features of planet Earth, is that it propagates life, and it propagates all forms of life. It's one of the key features, one of the key dynamics of our planet. But these astronauts also saw a common home, and they also, if you like, invited us to see that. They invited us to see that we can exist beyond divisions, whether it was class, race, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, beyond nations. They wanted us to see that this is a common place that we all need to care for and protect. And this is one of the key things about Earth Day, is to bring an awareness around our common home, our common, if you like, Earth system that we all share. The other point that I'd like to make by way of introduction is that the system we are living in today, and it's been constructed over 500 years, is premised on violence, exploitation, and destruction. It's what we would call ecocide, the mass-scale destruction of human and non-human life. And this system has really brought us to the brink of extinction. And we really got to think deeply about the system. We tend to believe that, progress and growth and all the things that it expresses in everyday life, shopping malls, industrial scale fishing, more carbon-based production systems, etc. We tend to think that this is all good things, but actually they're not. Very, very serious price. There's this logic of destruction that's invisible, and it's really catching up with us. And so it's very, very important today that we think together about how do we overcome ecocide? How do we live in a way that ends the war with nature and Earth? So that's another very important reason why we're convening this assembly today, is to broach that question with you as the Climate Justice Charter Movement. The third reason for this assembly is to recognize the urgencies of climate science. The sixth cycle of reporting has just been completed by the UN. It's given us the most important documents that humanity has to confront the climate crisis. The documents continue to raise the alarm bell very, very loudly, and that within the next decade, we know we'll be overshooting 1.5 degrees Celsius because of a failure of leadership internationally and even in our own country. This is going to have devastating consequences. Our response as the Climate Justice Charter Movement is to accelerate the deep, just transition now, because we can limit harm. We can and must bring down carbon emissions to ensure we don't have further catastrophic climate change down the road for future generations and so on. So part of that process, we are trying to give content to the deep, just transition. We are translating the 14 systemic alternatives of the Climate Justice Charter into policies. And today we have two very, very important policy frameworks that we want to share with you. One is around the rights of nature and natural climate solutions. It's gone further than the second framework we'll share with you. And we're putting it up for discussion and deliberation. These are big ideas, they're powerful ideas, and they can play a very, very important role in accelerating the just transition. The second set of ideas that we'll be sharing is around zero waste and simple living. Again, very important, very big ideas, but again, they help us try to find this sort of human presence in earth relations, the human presence in natural relations. And this is key if we are to survive and if we are to thrive on planet Earth. And finally, the reason we're convening this assembly is because we've taken a big leap as the Climate Justice Charter movement. We had a conference in March and we reflected deeply about the worsening climate crisis, but as part of the larger poly crisis. And we recognize that all of this is converging, is interconnected, and it is worsening. But that doesn't mean that we cannot rise to the moment. And it's in that context we adopted 4 very, very important strategies to change the game around the climate crisis, to change the game around the poly crisis. And we also took a very firm decision that beyond just advocating for the world's first climate justice charter, we are now going to build a mass-based movement, a people and worker-driven movement to accelerate the deep just transition. So that's the other reason why we've convened today. And we have a very, very engaged and focused program. Charles, I don't know if you could share that program very quickly and we can commence. We'll kick off with a report back from our March conference. We'll then have the input on the rights of nature and natural climate solutions remain a draft. We are launching it today for public engagement. We'll then have a discussion around zero waste and simple living, which is also in the charter. But again, key ideas to kind of figure this out, we'll share with you. And I must add that this policy development work is being led by younger people, younger activists in the climate justice charter movement space. And yeah, we should really be proud of the efforts and their contributions that they are making to figure out the deep just transition. We'll have some discussion, and then we'll have a panel around building the climate justice charter movement, sharing some practices, sharing some experiences and lessons, and inviting you all to work with us to build. So that's the program. And without further ado, I'd like to invite, I think it's Charles Simane, to present us with the conference report of the CJCM. Charles?
Thank you so much, Fish. I'm just going to share my screen. Vish, if you will allow me, can I switch off my camera just to protect the quality of my connection?
Sure, Charles.
Thank you so much. So thank you all, comrades, and happy Earth Day again. And thank you for joining us today. I'm kicking off with the conference report. At our very historic conference, which involved youth, trade unionists, community activists, organizations representing the disabled, faith-based organizations, and academics, we recognized that South Africa and the world are at a fateful moment. The climate crisis is worsening, and it is intersecting with various systemic crisis tendencies like hunger, inequality, resource peak, and of course, the unraveling of a weak market democracy in South Africa. We believe that the Climate Justice Charter, with its plurivision to address the legacies of apartheid, the current poly crisis we are living in, and secure a livable, just, and democratic future, is our lodestar to confront our collective challenges. So in the conference, we noted the following things. We collectively noted that ruling elites are failing and they do not have solutions to the crisis that we are living in. There is a lack of political will to address carbon footprints of wealthy individuals and countries. We've seen this by the failure of the COP process and the continuity of the EcoSide project. We also noted that South Africa's just energy transition is a narrow and technocratic approach. South Africa's just energy transition, as we have seen from the JETP funding, is premised on debt, and secondly, it is premised on export-led green hydrogen, electric vehicles, and private sector renewable energy. It is for this reason that we noted that it is a narrow and technocratic approach. We also noted that the ANC government is still committed to a coal-heavy energy mix, offshore oil and gas extraction. We are seeing the ANC government accelerating the gas amendment bill and the upstream petroleum development bill. These are laws that are meant to enlarge the legal infrastructure for for further oil and gas extraction of our oceans and further oil extraction, including the extraction of methane. We also noted that South Africa's shallow market democracy, which privileges the power of corporations, is at a very, very dangerous place. We also noted that a desperate society is becoming increasingly criminalized, with whistleblowers being assassinated, and with assassinations on the rise, coupled, of course, with the femicide that is also continuing with impunity, and with corrupt politicians who are escaping prosecution. And there is a failure to ensure there is a failure to enforce the law, and there is a failure to hold criminals accountable. There's also a failure to ensure constitutional centered government and citizens' rights are not being protected, and they are also not being affirmed. So in the conference, we collectively declared to accelerate the deep just transition to address the polycrisis. Through transformative policies, we will collectively work to champion a global climate justice bloc for a just world peace, earth democracy, and a climate justice deal for Africa. Secondly, people and worker-driven just transition for a climate justice deal, climate emergency state in our communities, workplaces, and sectors. And thirdly, through transformative strategic policies, we will renew our constitutional democracy through deep democracy and systematically build and institutionalize the CJCM into a people and worker-driven movement. We also collectively declared that will translate the 14 systemic alternatives of the Climate Justice Charter into policies. This will happen through policy working groups to ensure we give content to the deep just transition and substance to the rallying cry of systems change, not climate change, and ground our democratic eco-socialist program. Also, we will develop a climate justice deal for South Africa in Africa, as the CJCM will be working towards a climate emergency social contract to allocate resources, redirect the South African economy, and mobilize society. It will advance a transformative approach to macroeconomic policy to accelerate the deep just transition. The CJCM umbrella campaign to accelerate the deep just transition will build capacities for transitions in communities, workplaces, sectors, and of course the state. This will happen through our CJCM policies, food sovereignty pathways, solidarity economy networks, our planning tool, our narrative building through storytelling, and other tools that we will be developing. CJCM bottom-up movement building processes and practices. We declared in the conference that the CJCM is not a political party, but a unique movement transforming South Africa in communities, workplaces, sectors, and the state to accelerate the deep just transition, to ensure local and societal scale transformation happens through the rapid phase out of fossil fuels, and to limit further climate harm and build nature-centered ecological systems. Guided by the CJC, the needs of workers, grassroots women, and the vulnerable will be prioritized. So running through a daily synthesis report of the conference, the first session on the first day was centered on the CJCM strategic perspectives. Now, the four strategic perspectives are premised on the following. Firstly, an understanding that the total crisis we are living in is intersecting and it is getting worse. Climate shocks have increased in frequency and they've also increased in intensity. Secondly, ruling classes and the global power structures, including the UN, FCC, and its COP process, have failed human and non-human life in terms of the climate challenge. Thirdly, climate justice politics and activism is a new transformative politics. It is generative politics which builds alternatives from below, addresses the climate crisis through intersectionality, and it is trans-political activism. It goes beyond single issues. So just a run through of the CJCM strategic perspectives. The first strategic perspective document, resisting climate apartheid and ecocidal capitalism towards a global climate justice bloc for a just world peace, earth democracy, and a climate justice deal for Africa. This document argues that the global North's response to the climate crisis is premised on a logic of climate apartheid, meaning that some people and nations who are darker, poor, and non-Euro-American are expandable. It is also premised on ecocide, the mass-scale destruction of human and non-human life. Of course, this is consistent with the global North's history of colonial conquest, imperial domination, and more recently, COVID-19 vaccine apartheid. Meanwhile, the climate ecological rift is worsening and it is engendering other systemic crises. The global eco-fascist project marches on with the center-right and the hard-right neoliberals, as well as maturing systemic crisis tendencies, contradictions, and disruptions in global capitalism. Capitalism is destroying itself and the ruling classes are not able to prevent this. And we cannot let it destroy all of us in the process. Hence, this first strategic perspective document argues that we need to work towards decentering power away from the failed UN COP process towards a global climate justice bloc of vulnerable governments, peoples, workers, and movements for a just world peace, earth democracy, and a climate justice deal for Africa. It also argues that this is the third cycle of climate justice resistance, and it must go beyond crowd politics, single issues, symbolic and apocalyptic politics towards trans-political solutions. The second strategic perspective document, the ANC-led alliance and state is the main obstacle to a deep just transition towards people and worker-driven climate justice transition for a climate justice deal and climate emergency state, argues that the ANC-led alliance and state is the main obstacle to accelerate and deepen the just transition. For decades, the ANC has been translating neoliberal ideology, promoting the power of global monopoly capital into Afro-neoliberal and indigenizing it in South African national discourse, and we're also seeing this in policy practices. The ANC has continued the pattern of accumulation through ecocide, the mass-scale destruction of human and non-human life. The historical processes of expansion in South Africa have premised themselves on accumulation through ecocide, whether it be from the colonial to the apartheid, and even to the government that we have now. So this second strategic perspective document argues that the ANC's Afro-neoliberal state has constructed a rich black patronage elite at the expense of the starving and the structurally unemployed masses. It abandoned the nation building project a long time ago, hence it failed to build a non-racial state. The document proposes a struggle for a people and worker-led climate justice deal framework, and climate emergency state to realign class and popular forces to end dependence on carbon energy. The third strategic perspective document, Transforming South Africa's Criminalized Market Democracy, Advancing Deep Democracy for a Deep Just Transition. Document 3 argues that South Africa does not have a constitutional democracy, but a market democracy. Post-apartheid South Africa is a shallow and criminalized market democracy plagued by exclusionary nationalisms. Now, this has hampered the envisioned and globally celebrated constitutional project which emerged post-apartheid. The constitution has the potential to ensure transformation, national purpose, and an inclusive nation-building project, but it requires transformative policies and deep democratization. So this document argues that the fragmentation of the labor movement caused by the ANC-led alliances is one of the most serious threats to this democracy. Without a united and independent labor movement, South Africa faces a very bleak future. Thus, the document argues for renewing our constitutional democracy by testing the potential and tools of our constitution to advance deep democracy for the deep, just transition. The fourth strategic perspective document, Ensuring South Africa's 2024 national elections are climate justice elections, build a new political instrument now, build a mass-based and worker-driven climate justice charter movement, is an elaboration of the strategic politics of the CJCM. It deals with the critical question of how we think and act in climate politics, how we build mass power and shape the transition to transformative politics. It argues for building the climate justice charter movement as a mass-based and worker-driven movement anchored in accelerating and deepening the just transition from below, in communities, in workplaces, in sectors in the state, while being tactically flexible to contest state power. It proposes a movement party role during elections as part of a broad paradigm of power. This document mainstream climate politics, neither vanguard, horizontal, nor electoral politics. What is needed is transformative intersectional politics, which means a politics that is rooted in decoloniality, emancipatory feminism, radical queer, that is anti-ecocide and anti-capitalist. Now, the CJCM reflects this kind of politics because it seeks to defend the natural commons from below and advance democratic systemic reforms. The document argues that for the CJCM to embrace a new paradigm of power, including contesting the 2024 national elections to ensure the corrupt and carbon-addicted ANC does not get a majority, we are able to mainstream the climate emergency through a parliamentary presence. Now, in the discussion of these strategic perspective documents, key thematic issues emerged and delegates suggested the following. One, intersectionality must be central to the strategic analysis in order to fully appreciate the disproportionate manner in which the climate crisis is impacting different groupings of people, be it class or race or gender, disability, sexuality, or ethnicity. Also, conference said that documents must speak to a transformative Pan-Africanism deeply rooted in African philosophies such as Ubuntu. While the documents analyze the polycrisis, they must be centered on the politics of hope and systemic transformations from below. Progressive political education must also be central in the strategic perspectives in order to build politically conscious activists who will not repeat the failures of the old left. Conference also said that the strategic perspectives must address the causes of the fragmentation within the climate justice movements in South Africa and how to overcome these disunities. Also, members of the CJCM must familiarize themselves with these strategic perspectives and communicate them to different constituencies in a way that bridges the knowledge gap and disseminates information to all audiences. So that was the first session of the first day. And then the second session was discussing some of the documents that we are currently working on, some of the policy development, democratizing the water commons, rights of nature, natural climate solutions, zero waste, food sovereignty, eco-mobility, and socially owned and community-based renewable energies. Now, there are three constant thematic areas which cut across all of these policies. To begin with, they speak to the danger of failing to implement transformative alternatives. In other words, they show the danger of continuing on the current ecocidal path. They answer a critical question, which is, what happens if we do nothing? Meaning, what happens to our water, our biodiversity, our food, our energy systems, our transport systems, and way of life if we do not implement people's systemic alternatives from below? The second thematic area that cuts across all these policies is decarbonization, adaptation, and transformative regeneration. Decarbonizing energy systems, transport, decarbonizing food production, and the entire economy and society at large is the only way to prevent the annihilation, of life-enabling systems. The policies also speak to adaptation, meaning preparing for more climate extremes and adjusting to existing and worsening climate impacts. Now, the conference emphasized that the policies must be followed by implementation plans and clear timelines. In this discussion, the conference noted the lack of faith in the current government to implement transformative policies. It was strongly noted that the current government has been working to fragment and weaken civil society through controlled spaces and meaningless tick box participation in policy development. Delegates asked, can this crisis-ridden government accelerate the deep just transition? The unanimous answer, of course, was no. Conference emphasized the speedy development of all systemic alternatives for transformative change into policies. The second day began with a discussion on the umbrella campaigns to accelerate and deepen the just transition, discussed the CJ deal, food sovereignty pathways, people's planning tool, and the presentation by Oceans Not Oil, as well as a presentation by SAFSE. The conference noted that the poly crisis requires a multi-pronged approach, meaning a trans-political approach that goes beyond single issues. The conference noted that unity is crucial in building a climate justice bloc to ensure that struggles are not in silos. This came out strongly in the conference as CJCM members were reiterating the importance of building a united mass-based movement to advance intersectional struggles for justice. Conference also noted with concern the division between climate justice movements in South Africa and the need to build dynamic solidarities, even if tactics, strategies, or analysis might not be the same, but the enemy is one, and that is carbon capital. And then the second session discussed the constitution, fundraising strategy, membership and recruitment strategy, as well as the communication strategy. These strategy documents and the constitution were in the first phase of drafting. Conference made several recommendations for each of these documents. With regard to fundraising, conference emphasized the need for the financial independence of the movement by building internal funding mechanisms to accelerate the deep just transition. A conference cautioned about membership fees as the country is facing a cost of living crisis. It was agreed that the conversation on funding mechanisms must be discussed further, leading up to the October conference. Without its own financial resources, conference noted, the CJCM will not be independent. Concerning the membership and recruitment strategy, it was emphasized that the quality of members is more important than the quantity. The CJCM is in a new phase beyond advocacy and is now about bottom-up movement building, and it must consolidate areas of strength. A recruitment must be married to conscientizing and building climate-conscious activists who understand the intersectionality of struggle and the need to accelerate the deep just transition. Conference noted that the communication strategy must dynamize social media communication. It also noted that communication must always be inclusionary and ensure that no person is left behind in understanding the message as well as the goals of the movement. Conference also noted that all of these strategies will be further elaborated upon during the course of the year towards the October conference. Members and partner organizations are, of course, invited to make comments on all of these policies before the 28th of August this year. Conference also welcomed the draft constitution, and it will be the responsibility of the CJCM Activist Forum to work on the draft constitution and make all the necessary amendments in preparation for the October conference. As a way forward, conference decided that the following must be done. Firstly, we must convene a caucus of CJCM aligned local government councillors to provide research, capacity building, and network support to accelerate the deep just transition, to convene a COPEC CJCM National Activist Forum. We have convened this forum. We had our first meeting this week, to convene an online FD assembly, which is what we are doing now, to convene an online assembly with trade unions in May. This is going to be on the 18th of May from 5 to 7. To convene a hybrid youth assembly on June 16 under the banner, the next youth struggle is the climate justice struggle, build the CJCM now. To convene an online women's assembly on the 9th of August under the banner, Women for Climate Justice and Emancipatory Feminism. Again, all inputs for draft policies, the constitution, and other CJCM movement documents are to be submitted to COPEC by the 28th of August. And also conference concluded to convene the CJCM conference in October on eco-socialism to launch our democratic eco-socialism program, formalize the CJCM, launch the CJ deal for South Africa, and finalize our position on the 2024 elections. Thank you so much, Fish. That's the conference report. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. As comrades can note, this was a very comprehensive engagement at the conference. We looked at the larger political terrain on which we're struggling and thought deeply about how do we shift and tilt power towards climate justice. We thought deeply about how do we give content to the acceleration of the just transition? What are the nuts and bolts of that just transition? What are the policies we need? We thought deeply about our institutional form and how do we build the CJCM? So that's where we are, comrades. That document that Charles gave you an overview of will be shared with everybody. It's our March conference report. So Charles, I don't know, would you share the PDF, or you might share the link and so on, so people can take that back. As Charles underlined, a lot of work we've kicked off through the March conference is up for discussion. So we'd really like you to take the report back into your organizations, engage with the frameworks on communication, on membership, on constitution, and please give us feedback. But we'll further affirm that as this meeting and assembly unfolds. We're going to move quickly to the next input, and then we'll have an open discussion session, but after the next two inputs. So the next input, sadly, is back on Charles's shoulders. Again, one of the very exciting young people, dynamic, smart in our space, working and leading around the rights of nature and natural climate solutions policy. So Charles, over to you. This is an integral part of the Climate Justice Charter. It's one of 14 systemic alternatives. And Charles will present an overview of the policy framework, the draft that we're launching today. Charles?
Thank you so much, Fish. Let me just share my screen. Can you see that?
Yeah, yes, we can.
Thank you so much, Fish. So today we are launching the the rights of nature and natural climate solutions draft policy for public engagement. So just to run through what the policy is about and the basis behind it. As we all know that the climate crisis is a threat multiplier, and nowhere is this clearer than in the loss of biodiversity. There is a direct proportionality relationship between increased warming and species extinction. The IPCC, in its sixth cycle of reporting, noted that a 3-degree increase in planetary warming will lead to 41% of mammals losing their habitat. Now we know that Southern Africa is warming at about twice the global rate of temperature increase, meaning that as the world overshoots by 1.5 degrees, our region will overshoot by 3 degrees. Now, this is going to be a disaster for biodiversity in biodiversity loss in South Africa. So hence the urgent need for this policy. Now, the policy aims to advance the following goals. The first being, of course, to advance an awareness that we thrive and coexist on one planet. This is the third goal of the Climate Justice Charter. This policy advances an ecosystems awareness which situates humans in nature. Its goal is to advance holistic, complex systems thinking, which respects the wholeness of life forms, as well as the inter and intra-relationships between humans and non-human life. The second goal, of course, is to inspire a break with anti-human as well as human-centered approaches to biodiversity. The third goal is to drive an earth-centered approach to biodiversity and conservation. This approach rejects the logic of corporate environmentalism, which posits non-human life as mere natural capital to be exploited. Instead, this policy is about defending the natural commons. And by natural commons, I'm referring to land, water, biodiversity, creative human labor, and the earth systems. All of these are central to the deep just transition to bring down emissions and to ensure ecosystem adaptation capacities. As we all know, our oceans are carbon sinks, as well as releasing 50% of our oxygen. The fourth goal of this policy, of course, is to underline the emergency or the urgency of the climate crisis, as well as the tipping points and the feedback loops that it has engendered, some of which are now irreversible within the century. The fifth goal is to reimagine conservation, restoration, and management of non-human life forms, but also to reclaim nature-based solutions. And the ultimate goal of this policy is to preserve life, and also it is to strengthen the constitutional democracy of South Africa by advancing a community-centered approach to conservation through biodiversity and the natural commons. Now, South Africa is among South Africa is among the most biodiverse countries in the world. We have about 95,000 known species. We are home to about 10% of the world's plant species, 15% of the world's marine species, and about 7% of the world's mammals, reptiles, and bird species. So It boasts some of the highest rates of endemism in the world. However, this rich biodiversity is seriously threatened, and the climate crisis as a threat multiplier is only making things worse. So we have seen in our country that environmental protection measures are not being followed, and the perpetrators of ecocide, the mass-scale destruction of human and non-human life, they are not being held accountable. There's poor coordination between the government departments and agencies on biodiversity conservation. Now, this state of affairs is being worsened by the climate crisis, which is compounding all of these factors. But central to this document is an understanding that there is hope. Although we are seeing the loss of species, some of which, of course, is irreversible. Although we are seeing extinction rates going up exponentially, but there is hope because habitats can be regenerated, ecosystems can be restored, and the web of life can flourish. What we are seeing is that the Earth systems have an incredible ability to transform, to evolve, and to regenerate. However, time is of the essence. And if urgent action is not taken, then the rate of species extinction will continue to accelerate. So solving the crisis of biodiversity loss requires a transformative and decolonial way of thinking, which requires reconnecting with an earth-centered approach to biodiversity loss. Now, all of this is well argued in the strategic perspectives of the CJCM that I spoke about earlier on. Now, the Ecocide project in South Africa started with the domination of nature, women, and the racial other under colonialism. And it has continued with environmental apartheid, the legacy of which still persists today. Colonialism, of course, exploited the environment for the benefit of the colonial empire and the capitalists. Wildlife was decimated by trophy hunting, by ivory exports, and by culling. Colonial acts such as the National Parks Acts of 1926 prohibited non-white people from accessing the environment, while large swaths of land were overgrazed and destroyed through mechanistic tillage, which releases tons of carbon from the soil. So colonialism introduced the separation between humans and nature, and it undermined many of the emancipatory ecologies and indigenous worldviews that existed in Africa. Now we saw this with the Khoi and the San, the first environmentally conscious people in South Africa, who fought for generations to resist the enclosure of the commons. Of course, they were fighting against these colonial attempts to recreate home, to make South Africa look like Europe by introducing exotic foreign species. As it stands today, the impact of alien invasive species on South Africa's water runoff is estimated at about 1,4 to 2,4 billion cubic meters per year. Now, the apartheid regime continued the exploitation through ecocide by entrenching environmental racism and cramming Black people into tiny Bantustans. Now, the regime had very loose regulations over white farmers and their use of water and chemicals like insecticides, pesticides, and fertilizers, which over the years, of course, have been destroying water streams, causing eutrophication, and of course, insect loss. Insect loss is a serious problem that has not been given serious attention because it will result in a loss of pollinators, which will be catastrophic for the global food systems. Now, the post-apartheid democratic government has only continued this ecocide project. South Africa's biodiversity is deteriorating exponentially. And South Africa being one of the most biodiverse countries in the world with such high rates of endemism, we have 1,500 endemic vascular plants which are found nowhere else in the world. And secondly, more than 70% of our natural areas have been cleared, have been destroyed. So we are destroying endemic plants which are not found anywhere else in the world. Now, the 2018 biodiversity assessment made the following findings. It found that out of 1,021 ecosystems that were assessed, half of them are classified as threatened. Sorry. It found the highest proportion of critically endangered ecosystems is in rivers and wetlands. 42% of river ecosystems are critically endangered, while 61% of wetland systems are critically endangered. Now, damming, unsustainable water use, the climate crisis, and heavy metal spillage like acid mine drainage are the leading causes, coupled with the growing rate of sewage going into freshwater systems, due, of course, to the failure of the government. There is increased extinction rate in all taxonomical groups, meaning rates at all levels. Whether you are looking at a kingdom or a class or order or a family or a genus, there is simply increased extinction rates in all taxonomical groups. 70% of fish stocks have been fully exploited. 99% of ecosystems and estuaries are threatened with extinction, while in wetlands, it's 8% of species. Now, this is consistent with a biodiversity loss around at a global level. For example, if you look at amphibians, the International Convention of Nature has made these following estimates of threatened species with lower and upper estimates. For example, if you look at amphibians, the lowest estimate would be at 35% of amphibians being threatened with extinction, while the higher estimate will be 50% of amphibians. So the 41% they put there is more or less the average. Sharks, rays, 37%, mammals 21%, reptiles also. So that's one of the things the policy outlines: the biodiversity loss in South Africa and the biodiversity loss in the world. And then the policy also looks at the policy limits and challenges within South Africa. It addresses first and foremost problems with Section 24 and the fact that Section 24 advances a human-centered approach to protecting nature. Nature is protected for the enjoyment of present and future generations of humankind. Nature is not protected for its intrinsic value. So hence it's called anthropocentric. And then the policy deals with the consequences of a failure to have a specialized environmental court. Now, South Africa does not provide, our constitution that is, does not provide for the establishment of a specialized environmental court, nor has any act of parliament provided for the permanent establishment of a specialized court. There have been instances where a specialized environmental court was set up, for example, in the Western Cape in 2003, as well as in the Eastern Cape in 2007, when they set up a specialized court just for abalone, to combat abalone poaching. But of course, it was only dealing specifically with abalone poaching and no other environmental issues. And these are courts that had a very limited time span. So the consequences of not having a specialized environmental court is that there's always delayed adjudication. As we all know that our courts are overburdened. Nominees for the position of Chief Justice made this very clear when they appeared before the JCC. It is also well known that there's a delay in criminal cases, in all types of cases, be it environmental or criminal. And the other consequence of not having a specialized environmental court is that it makes ease of justice difficult to access. And the result is a lot of environmental cases, even though they are supposed to be cases about Section 24, but you find that they are cases about procedures. Once the state has followed the procedure, for example, to grant an environmental license, it then becomes difficult to challenge that on the basis of Section 24. Well, this comes from something called constitutional subsidiary, which means that where legislation is enacted to give effect to a constitutional right, a litigant may not bypass that legislation and rely directly on the Constitution without challenging the legislation as falling short of the constitutional standard. So you find a lot of environmental cases are merely cases of procedure, and they are not cases about protecting the environmental rights of peoples and communities. The policy also talks about the dangers of allowing mining regulation to be placed under a different department, the Department of Mineral Resources, rather than the Department of the Environment, because this has created a fractious regulatory system whereby we now see that we have 6,000 abandoned mines. 2,000 of them are a critical danger to communities. So there's been a failure to adequately enforce environmental regulation with regard to mining. Well, because of the historical privilege relationship that mining has enjoyed over the years, and the fact that the regulation of mining continues to be fragmented between two departments which do not have adequate departmental coordination. So there are several laws, of course, which have been enacted to give effect to Section 24 of the Constitution, such as the National Environmental Management Act, NEMA, which is the overarching law. But the problem is NEMA, for example, does not prohibit trophy hunting. Trophy hunting under NEMA is legal, provided that licensing procedures have been met. NEMA, of course, has failed to prevent the overexploitation of marine life through industrial fishing. NEMA does not ban culling, and of course, like Section 24 itself, NEMA is based on human-centered set of regulations which do not respect the intrinsic value of non-human life. But the positive thing about NEMA is that NEMA has provided a broad legal standing for people to approach a court, and it has also enshrined the right of communities to say no. The problem is that many communities do not understand their rights because, as we know, South Africa is not a constitutionally conscious society. So another law, of course, is the Marine Living Resources Act of 1998. The 2014 amendment was meant to change regulations for small-scale fishers. But of course, the Marine Living Resources Act has criminalized a lot of small-scale fishing. It's been a disaster for small-scale fishers. Meanwhile, it has not prevented industrial fishing from destroying and overexploiting our water systems. Now, in some areas, regrettably, small-scale fishers are being forced into illegal fishing because they cannot obtain a fishing license. Because NEMA, the Marine Living Resources Act has made it very difficult for small-scale fishers to have fishing licenses. Meanwhile, it has been expanding the total allowable catch for large-scale industrial fishing. So in other words, people are now being turned into criminals in order to sustain their livelihoods. In 2020, South Africa exported around 10 billion rand worth of seafood, the top destination, of course, being Europe. So the Marine Living Resources Act has been centered on an export-led fishing network, which does not support small-scale fishers. The Biodiversity Act of 2004 is also another law enacted to give effect to Section 24. Now, the problem with this with this particular act is that it legalizes bioprospecting, which we call biopiracy, the capture of indigenous knowledge of plants for the purpose of commercial use. Now, along with the Genetically Modified Organisms Act of 1997, this particular act permits the release of genetically modified organisms into the environment, and it grants extraordinary discretionary powers to the Minister of the Environment on the regulation of genetically modified species, which is the next enclosure of the commons. The next act is the Integrated Coastal Management Act, which its purpose, of course, is to prohibit pollution at sea, also to prohibit incineration next to the ocean. But the act has failed to prevent pollution. South Africa disposes about 250,000 tons of waste into the ocean annually. Plastic, of course, makes up the bulk of this. In 2008, about 107,000 tons of plastic was disposed into the sea. Now, a lot of this plastic comes from the failure of municipalities to adequately deal with issues of waste management. So this is the waste that ends up on our ocean. Now we know that the SA coastline is due to its geographic location has a very high shipping volume, and we see cargo ships that contribute to pollution through black carbon, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide. The National Water Act also it has failed to protect wetlands and has not addressed the colonial legacy of private dams. One of the reasons why our water systems are fragmented. The National Forest Act of 1998, it has not been updated, of course, to meet the scale of biodiversity. I mean, in just 20 years between 2001 and 2020, South Africa lost about 26% of its tree cover. So these are just some of the acts, but of course the list is not exhaustive, but just to give you a picture of the failures in the policy implementation. So the CJC approach to rights of nature and natural climate solutions. Like I said at the beginning, that one of the things this policy aims to do is to reclaim nature-based solutions. Now, CJC approach to the rights of nature is based on a plurivision. Now, plurivision means addressing the legacies of the past, dealing with the crisis of today, and building a livable future for human and non-human life. CJC Rights of Nature is about reclaiming African emancipatory ecologies, indigenous philosophies. It's also about reclaiming indigenous knowledge, which has been discarded, of course. The CJC Rights of Nature is about rejecting corporate-led environmentalism, reclaiming natural climate solutions. Now we know that large corporations have been promoting carbon markets, carbon capture and storage. All of these are false solutions and are based on ideas of, geoengineering and techno approaches to the climate crisis. Now, this policy argues that natural climate solutions cannot be used as a substitute for urgently cutting down greenhouse gas emissions and rapidly phasing out fossil fuels. Also, natural climate solutions cannot be a cover-up for the capitalist enclosure of indigenous commons, nor can they misappropriate millennia of indigenous knowledge and practices. Now, 80% of global biodiversity is in indigenous lands. That must be noted in natural climate solutions. And these are lands that store 20% of carbon sequestered by tropical and subtropical forests. Now, immediate measures for the state to advance at a policy level to stop biodiversity loss must be taken. An immediate ban on trophy hunting, a ban on ivory and rhino horn trading with serious legal penalties like lifelong sentences imposed for offenders, wild meat trading to be properly regulated through existing laws to ensure that it protects the rights of animals and benefits local consumption. Urgent action must be taken to fix wastewater plants, to prevent raw sewage spilling into our oceans. Regulation on chemical plants near freshwater systems must be stopped or tightened and should be prohibited. Urgent estuary and wetland recovery plan must be developed. An abandoned mine rehabilitation plan and tailing dam strategy must be urgently developed as well to protect communities, regenerate ecosystems, and to protect water systems. Now, the management of biodiversity needs to transcend political borders through bioregionalism. For example, the demarcation of provinces or the demarcation of municipalities does not take nature into account. However, we know that with rising heat waves, with rising climate shocks, animals are going to need bio corridors in order to navigate these different climate extremes. So the management of biodiversity must transcend municipalities, must transcend provinces. Now, in a lot of provincial governments, there has not been a biodiversity strategy for that particular province. And hence, there's been a lack of enforcement procedures and mechanisms and stuff like that. Also, with regards to tree planting, because tree planting has been largely promoted as a trendy approach to the climate crisis. But we looked at tree planting through mixed species. We looked at tree planting through indigenous species. We also looked at restoration through the potentialities that lie in rewilding, because nature has an incredible ability to transform and regenerate itself when left to its own potentials. And we also advance decolonial convivial conservation, which deals with the socio-economic roots of biodiversity crisis, biodiversity loss and crisis, which of course are causing the sixth mass extinction that we are living in now. So there are some policy implications as I wrap up. A national register of indigenous sacred places and rock arts supported by documentation centers must be established. Further research must be done at universities on indigenous emancipatory ecologies. Our current national parks expanded through connected biocorridors to enable animals to be able to mitigate some of these increasing things like heat waves and stuff like that. Industrial scale fishing must be banned in South Africa. Promotion of biodiversity registers and protocols for our ocean commons, protection of our biomes, wetlands and forest and riverine systems, protected through people's biodiversity registers and protocols. Now, this is important also in ensuring that we have a people-centered and community-based approach to biodiversity instead of the exclusionary approach to biodiversity that we have seen over the years. Transition towns and eco-social housing must be developed to promote natural commons through parks, agroecology gardening systems, eco-walks, the protection of endemic wild species, and ecocide law must also be promoted and enacted for South Africa. An environmental court must be established. Environmentalism must be prohibited. Extractivism must be prohibited in communal land in South Africa, and people's rights to consent must be respected. So that's one of the things we talk about, people's biodiversity protocols as part of ensuring that we have a community-centered and people-based approach to biodiversity. Now, one of the things we also note in these policies that with all these different approaches, it is clear that something has to be done. However, there are also reactionary forces which seek to maintain the status quo. These reactionary forces are fascist in nature. They promote a lifeboat approach where they save their countries and their people while the rest of the world perishes. So it is thus essential that South Africa's attempt to protect biodiversity must stand resolute and firm, and that the climate and environmental justice is social justice. So I apologize for going over the time, but thank you very much. Bish, over to you.
Thank you, Charles. That was very, very important, and it gives insight into some of the sort of deeper thinking that's gone into the policies we have, the legislation we have, the gaps that exist, and where we want to take it in a transformative direction to ensure we accelerate the deep just transition. I mean, the point to take away, comrades, is that elephants, rhinos, animals, etc., they regenerate ecosystems. And the more we create spaces for them to thrive, the more biodiversity thrives. So that's very, very important. Biodiversity, trees, shrubs, plants, our ocean ecosystems absorbs carbon. So we have to keep these things resilient. We have to keep them dynamic as part of affirming the commons and commons management approaches to this. So that's crucial in what Charles has shared. Now, we are going to have a session for discussion, but we'll take one final input from Awande. This is a complementary input. The Charter provides for zero waste and simple living. And we've really been having some serious debates and discussions on how do you translate something like this, which is values-based, into policy for a country? How do you take it into a framework to accelerate the deep just transition? Because again, the country is basically being presented with a very narrow perspective on the just transition. It's all about energy. And that's what we're only hearing from the Presidential Climate Commission. And that is very short-sighted in our view. So over to Awande. Awande?
Thank you, Vish. I'm going to share my screen just for some points to help facilitate this discussion. So as Vish just said, now we've had some really interesting debates around how we translate this policy to help expand our conception of what a just transition needs to have and what a just transition or deep just transition is. This policy, I believe, also is probably one of the most central in terms of translating the principles and values of the Charter and also revealing those in the way in which it tackles the fundamental issues that we face with regards to how our society is currently structured, makes it difficult for us to transition towards the kind of shape of society that is required for us to meet the challenges that we face with regards to the climate crisis. So it has a lot of very interesting points, but I will try to break down in the most simplest form in ways for everyone to be able to engage and think around how we're thinking about this and maybe also how we can expand this. So zero waste and simple living policy, as Vish said, is part of the Charter, and it speaks to a number of things. And zero waste begins as the foundation of where simple living, the second part or the articulation of this policy, the other part of this policy comes out of. And fundamentally, it's a huge emphasis on a total redesign of not just how we do things materially in terms of the products we consume, but also in the way in which our society operates and the way in which it centers around consumption. We live in a consumer society. It's really hard to describe what society is or the way in which we operate without really touching on consumption at some point. So it's quite interesting or quite a big overlap, or sorry, it's such a hugely overlooked thing that in the way in which we speak of just transitions, it's centered around energy. Because there's a huge amount of how we operate in our society that contributes to the emissions that are contributing to the climate crisis. So it's a huge emphasis on redesign, reuse of products, reuse of services and goods that are channeled throughout our economy. Creating and breaking away from the linear concept of how a capitalist society operates, the lessons and things of that nature. These are kind of at the root of what drives emissions globally, particularly when you look at who's responsible for emissions, which regions are responsible for emissions, and what habits within our society are responsible for emissions. So we're looking at a whole number, a range of things in terms of fundamentally grappling with this problem. Consumption is also the bridge between zero waste and simple living. It's the way in which we understand the foundation of a zero waste society, the concept of a society which doesn't create waste, which is very efficient and effective in how it uses materials and reuses materials and spares them. But also it's the bridge to show in terms of from that basis, what kind of new society will be built that tackles and deals with the problem of the climate crisis. So I also just added this metric here, this graph, just to indicate that I think this is a way in which we're also thinking about how we're trying to tackle the problem from the zero waste and simple living perspective, and how it connects to the climate crisis. For example, here you're looking at South Africa's production versus consumption-based carbon emissions. So this is a very specific aspect of the transition, a very specific aspect of the decarbonization process, which is rooted in the way in which our societies function, and that consumption and production and the loop and the cycle in which they're entangled in. So what's also important to take into consideration in understanding the need for this policy, but also why zero waste and simple living is required in our society, is when you think about carbon inequality. So most of the time, carbon inequality is either spoken about or understood from the perspective of inequality between nations, developing countries versus countries in the global south, and who's responsible for contributing to global emissions. But there's also carbon inequality within societies and across societies. I think South Africans, we're very familiar with inequality from the conversation of inequality more generally, due to our structural circumstances, due to apartheid and colonialism, and the failures of our governments over the past 29, 30 years or so, as ability to deal with those gaps. But those circumstances and those perspectives also have reflection in terms of carbon emissions and carbon inequality. So very interesting and very productive kind of numbers in terms of how we think about it. How you can look at it is if you look at the period in which annual emissions globally grew the most, which is between 1990 and 2015. 1990, by that point, the world was already aware of our contribution to warming of the planet. So in that period that globally we've been conscious of what we're doing to our planet, emissions grew by 60%. And throughout that period, more specifically, the richest 10% of the world's population were responsible for more than half of total carbon emissions, depleting the global carbon budget by over a third. So despite understanding inequality between nations, even within societies and across societies, there's an inequality in terms of who's responsible for contributing to this crisis. But then also we see who's also is responsible for taking the load of this crisis, which tends to be the working class and the poorest parts of our global community, where you see 3.1 billion people, 50% of the world's poorest, accounted for only 7% of total emissions, and only 4% of the available carbon budget was used up by them. So this is the fundamental point in terms of tackling the climate crisis and any kind of transition that wants to be just, is to grapple fundamentally with what kind of societies have we created where this is the kind of disparity in terms of who's responsible and who's suffering the most. The richest 1%, in addition to this, also responsible for 15% of total emissions, where the richest 5% also responsible for a third of global emissions increases, 3 times more than that of the poorest 50% in the world. So this is also the heart of what a zero waste and simple living policy is trying to grapple with. These kind of discrepancies, putting them out there and speaking clearly in terms of who's responsible for the crisis and also who the load of dealing with the crisis has to be moved onto. When you look at it also in terms of the last 20 or 30 years, in terms of how we understand the continued growth of the of the climate problem, or the climate crisis, is that essentially globally we've been boosting the consumption of the already rich. The global finite carbon budget that we have left has been used to perpetuate the system and structure of society under which we currently live in. And the two groups that are most affected and face the most harm with future climate impact are obviously the poor and marginalized across the globe, who are already dealing with climate change effects, in the global south, particularly in climate hotspot regions such as here in Southern Africa and the African continent, but then also future generations who will inherit the depleted, if any, carbon budget that the world will have left after or if we reach the verge of climate breakdown. So this is a representation of what consumption and the cycle of consumption and production, which we have facilitated in this world that we have created in the society that we currently reside in, has led to. And if you take into consideration the goals and aspirations of reducing warming and reducing emissions by 2030, there are more points to take into consideration with regards to how much more difficult consumption and our current cycle of consumption makes that goal. You look at how the richest 1% per capita, their global footprint, or their carbon footprint rather, has presently roughly 35 times greater than what we require for 2030. That is the challenge that we're facing. The richest 10%, looking at 10 times more than the 1.5 degrees level. Into the lowest, lowering the richest 10% carbon footprints to reach that level would require a decrease in yearly carbon emissions by more than a third. So it's not something that is located necessarily squarely just at the level of states or interstates, but it's also in terms of the construction of society. So if our government has everything as it is right now and does not have a perspective which is in line with what the Charter has, a holistic, deep, just transition embedded in a range of principles and alternatives that fundamentally transform our society, what we do is we just completely change our energy system to a more renewable, carbon neutral system that upholds the same cycle of production and consumption that is emitting and contributing to emissions at this scale. When you look at it from a South African perspective, South Africa is just a microcosm of what's happening at the global level. As I said previously, with regards to our high levels of inequality, you can see what that looks like in terms of not just within our country, but also continentally, because South Africa also has a historical and a different kind of responsibility and contribution to this problem at the continental level, not just within our society with regards to the rich. And you can see that the differences between the bottom 50% accounting for 11% of emissions in comparison to the top 5%, 73% emissions contribution. So these are the kind of things that we have to grapple with, in which this policy is squarely head on trying to fundamentally reverse and shift into something which fits the holistic vision of what the Charter puts forward. And with regards to simple living, building up from this perspective of what crisis we're currently grappling with and what challenges we have to meet, simple living wants to shape from the Zero Waste Foundation a different configuration of how society grapples with this challenge in terms of how we as individuals, people, units, families, communities consume, but also relate to each other. Because consumption has also shaped and changed the way in which we see community and the way in which we see what it means to live a fulfilled life in society. So simple living, this policy is looking at creating simple living commons. We want to shape and change the ways in which we articulate what wealth is in society, fundamentally dealing with the problem of culture and meaning making in our society, removing and breaking away from the treadmill of production and consumption, creating public spaces, culture and leisure centers that help facilitate new ways of community engagement, interaction, and what it means to enjoy life in the society. There are also adjacent policies that are connected to the simple living and zero waste perspective, UBIC being one of them, in the ways in which it helps create cushion for people between jobs. It will help facilitate the deep just transition to take place across sectors, not just the energy sector in society, giving people the kind of income and financial help required for the scaling and retraining that will require them to shift to these new eco housing and buildings and transition towns. Also is fundamentally connected to zero waste and simple living, because we're talking about redesigning not just products, but our communities, our cities, our spaces. From the top down, from the bottom up, everything needs to be reconfigured and reshaped to be able to facilitate and expand and heighten a zero waste and simple living perspective. Shared affluence, or the concept of shared affluence, is another thing which we're working with in terms of how we create new ways of understanding or articulating wealth, meaning making, creating a new culture of consumption within our societies, expanding library services as an example of this is a way in which we can create new collective spaces for people to be able to engage and receive the goods and services that they require to live a fulfilled life, but to not engage in the kind of gluttonous accumulation and consumption which the world has been stuck within for the past 50 or so years. So this is the ways in which I said at the start of how this policy is speaking to kind of the societal value systems of what the CJC puts forward in its goals and its principles and across its various alternatives. So in essence, we're trying to create a formulation of society in which simple living, or a system of simple living for sustaining life, as we're moving towards a world which is going to be faced with more harms, more crises and disasters, which makes sustaining life much harder than it currently is. So just to wrap up, some 3 conceptual legs just for everyone to be able to just hold and think about in terms of how we're trying to formulate and build this policy, as I'm speaking now about shared affluence, creating a new conception of what wealth is, shared wealth, societal wealth, shared prosperity across a society, commoning for ecological sufficiency or subsistence, to be able to meet the needs of human beings and nature. So these 2 parts also tie quite nicely with what Charles was speaking about with regards to the rights of nature, is that we're talking about a social ecological restructuring or social ecological transformation. So it's about moving beyond just the conception of human society and the health of human society as a metric for well-being or successful management of a society, creating these connections and these spaces, this shared prosperity, in a way that is contributive to ecological sufficiency and subsistence. And then human nature and flourishing, as I was saying now, and Charles touched on certain things that speak to this, such as the bioprotocols in the rights of nature policy. So this is the way in which and simple living helps to tackle the carbon emissions of our society, the ways in which it will assist in accelerating the deep just transition and adaptation, the ways in which it will help lead to transformative regeneration, and also finding ways to make sure these processes are happening from below, where there's a role for communities, there's a role for workers in their workplaces, and a role for the state. So I'll end it there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Awande and Charles, for very thought-provoking sort of presentations around 2 key areas of what we call democratic systemic reforms to accelerate and deepen the just transition. I mean, just to make one point before I open it up for discussion, this idea of shared affluence, we've had serious debates about it. And what it really means is that we are talking about collective public goods. There aren't sufficient amount of resources for the just transition to happen. Not everyone can have an electric vehicle. There are objectively limited resources on planet for that kind of approach, which is very much the American approach. So we're going to have to affirm clean energy public transport systems, community and socially owned renewable energy systems, and so on, and food sovereignty systems, etc. So these are some of the issues that impact on and ground shared affluence. Anyway, with that, I'd like to open that up for further input and comment. There were some hands up. I think Ann Knott, you posted something in the comment section about unity. Maybe Charles, you want to respond to that? And reaching out to other movements. Charles, are you there?
Yes, Fish.
Go ahead.
It's always important for all movements in the climate justice space to work together. But of course, we will always have different approaches to the same problem, basically. So some movements may be doing some other activities. It's all part of the tactical flexibility in climate justice politics. But it should not be taken as a sign of disunity. It's about different approaches to the same problem, different tactical flexibilities about the same problem. But we appreciate that and we support that. And many people who are in this webinar, after the webinar, they are going to be part of other activities by other movements. So we are coming from all angles. We are on the streets. At the same time, we are working on policies for systemic transformations. At the same time, we are putting pressure on all fronts, basically. So that is what is happening. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Charles. I mean, just to add, the Climate Justice Coalition has done great work, particularly around energy issues, DMRE, etc. And we salute them. They've endorsed the charter. But our approach within the Climate Justice Charter movement is to tackle the totality of the just transition and to try and figure out the different elements around it and to give it a real substance and content. Janet, you want to ask something? Your hand's up. Go ahead. Charles, I don't know if this is enabled or not.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, great. Hi, thanks everybody. And thanks for great presentations. I've just got one comment about the second one, about simple living. And it's really just about the term simple living, because I really like and agree with this shared affluence idea and the emphasis which should be on meeting people's needs, you know, to have a good life, a decent life. And we can do that within our ecological boundaries and the limitations. And I think we have to agree on that. So I mean, this idea that's come from South America of buen vivir, of a good life that is possible, but in a context where people don't have enough, and most people are poor and don't have enough food or energy or water, to talk to them about simple living it doesn't gel, I don't think. I mean, I think it's, you know, to talk to people about having a good life or a decent life or meeting people's needs has more resonance. And I'm thinking about how one could phrase it, or also just to demonstrate it in practice, you know, like how what you are putting forward actually does meet people's needs. So the food sovereignty idea, of course, that people's needs are met through controlling their own food production. But anyway, that's my idea. Is just this idea of simple living is a little bit, it doesn't quite gel in this context. Thanks.
So that's welcome, Janet. I mean, I think we need to look at the Amadiba community struggle, where they basically told Mantasht and others that they are not poor. They are not wanting to be like the rest of South Africa. They live in huts. They have local food systems. They forage. They engage in sort of the ocean commons sharing, etc. And there's rich culture there. And that's what we were trying to grapple with. But I'm going to leave it to Awan to say more. Awan, please respond.
Thanks, Vish. Thanks, Janet, also for that input. I think you're engaging with this policy, you're engaging with the thinking around it, because what you're saying and the question that you posed is one which also speaks to the challenge that these policies have to kind of meet, right? About speaking to people and translating the alternative vision that they put forward. And I think that when you spoke about Buen Vivir and the good life, it speaks to that. That's the heart of what shared. Part of it of what you're saying in terms of how then do you communicate to people who are struggling or suffering under the current conditions that we find ourselves in. How do you communicate to those people the concept of, saying simple living when people want a good life? And I think that that's part of the challenge of what it means to have a systemic plurivision, is to show people that there are differences in what a good life looks like. So I think the whole concept of simple living in itself and the principles of simplicity also extend the fact that you can have a good life without a lot of what has been, articulated as the trappings of a good life in the past 40 years or 100 years or so of, consumption, private jets, what we see with regards to social media being able to advertise unsustainable lifestyles. The challenge is also to completely reconfigure what it's a good point. But I think that also it's one of the things we also working with and also confronting in making these policies.
Okay, thanks. I don't know, Anne, your hand's still up. Do you want to ask something? Anne, please go ahead. Oh no, hands up. Okay, Karuna Mohan, you want to ask something? Karuna?
Sorry, thanks, Vish. I wanted to just give an input on this debate that we're having. Yeah. I think one of the big things about why we want to look at things being simple is because life is too complicated right now. And maybe the biggest issue is what aspirations and desires get presented and shaped, by the people. How do leaders actually display what is simple? And maybe that's what we want to transform. And that's what each of the organizations should be talking around. I think we know that urbanization and industrialization has actually messed us up right now. And that is why we have a climate crisis. But the question on that is, how do we plan? Do we plan for people to come together and really cohere amongst each other and protect the future? Or do we complicate things? And the final point I want to make on this is, in the end, it's what framing do we all use for development and for the future? And so whether it's simple living or whether it's another word, I think the content of what goes into that is more important. Thank you, Vish.
Thanks, Karuna. Stele, and then I'll give it back to Charles and Awande. And I think Patrick Bond also asked a question, Charles, just please note that as well. And that's about polluter pays and so on.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Vish, and thanks to everybody that's here today. I absolutely love the fact that even though I couldn't make it to the conference itself, that we have this opportunity to get some feedback on it. It's always encouraging for me to spend some time around people that speak my language, because sometimes it sounds like the things we talk about is, like airy-fairy and it's out there, and to have people that understand it's actually very simple, very logical, and very necessary. So some of the comments that I just wanted to make at this time, and Vish, I love that you just keep saying about how various debates have been happening around the concepts that have been shared today again as well. And debate is just so important. So for me, I love the idea that we need to make sure that all voices are being heard, and that we are receiving inputs from various sides. I wanted to actually speak to the point on shared affluence, which is something that I try to practice myself. And very often, my friends will say to me, but how are you able to do this? You don't have a job. You are a person living with disability. You're living in a dangerous area. And sort of just noting all the things that as society we look at as disadvantages, and yet people can come to me and say, can you please help me with this? I'm running short on this. Can you help me with that? Because I really try to practice this idea of sharing affluence. And it's also linked to the idea of we seem to think that privilege is something that is the domain of the elite. That privilege is something that you have because, say, for instance, you are rich, you live in a nice area, you have things. That means you're privileged. Whereas that community you were referring to that said, we don't see ourselves as poor, just because we're not living a lifestyle that people would see as successful. And so I really try to share with the communities and places where I speak to say that we all need to check our privilege. For me, something that became so evident during COVID was when I was listening to colleagues, I was listening to people that I spend time with in conferences and so forth, discussing about how difficult it was for them to be in lockdown, how difficult it was to be in their homes, to be stuck behind these high walls that they put up. And I was like, oh, it's almost like COVID doesn't even exist in my area, because first of all, nobody was sent home from jobs because they didn't have jobs in the first place. The way that we survive is to share what we have with each other. So that was still happening. Children were running around outside and playing together. There's a sense of community that, was established and still continued. So when we speak about things like privilege and like affluence, we need to be careful that we aren't unintentionally speaking down to a different group, maybe just because we haven't heard their voices and we haven't heard their side of things. Having said that, it is true that so many people in South Africa, in the world, have internalized the idea that they don't have, just because they don't have a particular thing, and they overlook the various things that they do have. And sometimes things that we've been convinced that we need is maybe not such a need as much as a want. Even something as simple as housing. And, where, as we've said, even our current government has perpetuated traditions and behaviors that was actually not useful, and it's actually just based in colonialism and in the apartheid regimes, whereby want to just give everyone their own house instead of realizing that that's not sustainable, and that it makes more sense that we have shared living spaces and so forth. So thank you again. I really appreciate the time that we have together. I appreciate the sharing that we are doing, and may we continue with this. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I mean, listen, there are big issues at stake here, and it's about what we consider to be progress. What is development? Is growth the only way to think about our societies, and so on? So there's a whole set of big issues at stake here, And so, we are reaching for a framework that can hopefully kind of take us in a different direction, where we rethink values, we rethink our conception of what is needs, and so on. So, I think that this is just the kickoff of this conversation. There's one more hand I'm going to take because we have one more panel. Tsepo, and then I'll hand over to Awande and Charles for quick feedback, even on the comments. Tsepo, you wanted to say something? Please be brief. Tsepo? Yeah. How's it? Go ahead.
Yes. Brilliant conversation and brilliant presentations from the colleagues. One thing for me that is I would say, use the analogy, screaming glaringly loudly at me, is that in these engagements, once everything is being, or rather, while everything is being discussed about, we need to then break it down and bring it down to the people, in particularly the residential areas, your townships and other such places, so that they then have, we then get that buy-in from them, so that as we proceed and speak of climate justice and speak of just transition, we bring them on board to make them see the relevance of such things happening, of such activities happening. Because, for instance, I'll make reference to one of the things my organization is currently engaged with within our community. There's a lot of illegal dumping that is happening, and this then has a negative knock-on effect, not only on the environment itself, but also on the lived experience of people around those areas where illegal dumping is happening. And we are constantly, slowly but surely, conscientizing them to the dangers of such activities happening, and encouraging and sort of leading them along a way of disposing of waste in an environmentally friendly manner. So mine was just to highlight that in all that we do and say, we need to also break down these concepts to bite-sized chunks, so that your ordinary Joe public and Jane public can easily relate to and understand. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And we fully agree. I mean, we've got to engage in, if you like, conversations that are accessible to everyone and so on. But nonetheless, we also have to have conversations that help us grapple with the big issues and the big changes. I think we all appreciate, as climate justice activists, our task is a big one. We've got to restructure society at a whole host of levels. Anyway, I'm going to give it back to Charles and Awande to give some final feedback, and then I'm going to hand over to Awande for the last panel. Charles, you want to go first? Any final comments from you?
Thank you so much, Fish. Just in response to something Patrick raised about the polluter pays principle, it has not been enforced, although it is in Section 28 and Section 30 of NEMA, but it has not been enforced. But also, the polluter pays principle could also enable some of these individuals or companies who are destroying the environment to get away with it by giving them a corporate escape. So one of the things we are asking for is to go beyond the polluter pays principle towards an ecocide law, to hold them accountable for the destruction of human and non-human life forms. So thank you for raising that.
Thank you, Charles. Awande, any final comments? There's a lot of comments in the chat today as well. Yeah.
Just want to say that I've just noticed some of the comments in the chat, also, and the ones that have come out from this conversation. Janet talking about enough and sufficient for useful. Clele also talking about ideas and perceptions, privilege and affluence, and how we think about those things. And I think, thank you for these comments, because this is the point, right? Is that we, in this space, within the climate justice space, we want to tackle and confront how we feel about these things, what we think about them. And this is part of the process, and how then we are able to communicate these ideas and articulate them to people throughout society more greatly. But these conversations have to start here, and we then concretize them in policy form. So we can also challenge just mainstream conceptions of what, you know, it means to have a good life and what it means to have a good life in our society. So as Vish was also talking about, in terms of how we're talking about reconfiguring and reshaping everything from top down because we have to. Crisis necessitates it. I think it's very clear to us that we're where we are because things are the way that they are. So why go any further, or why go so short as not to, you know, reconfigure all of it? And that's the point. So I take heart in these comments, and thank you for contributing to this discussion.
Thank you, Wande. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to you. I mean, again, keeping in mind we have to rethink everything in the context of the crisis. So Wande, at the last panel, over to you.
Thank you, Vish. So we're going to have a discussion on building the CJCM. I see some comrades unfortunately had trouble logging on because of load shedding issues. And I know that we're also running short on time. So we'll try to make sure that this is condensed discussion. So we'll start with Phumzile Mzaro as our first speaker. Phumzile, are you there?
Yes,
Hi, Phumzile.
I'm here. Yes, I'm here. First of all, I must thank you for the opportunity. I don't know whether you hear me, comrades.
Loud and clear.
Okay. First of all, I must thank you for the opportunity. And appreciate the fact that we are being given the report now, which we should take and revisit it so that we make more inputs. I must say that the CJM it's a great tool, of course, that we need to work together as an activist, because it does open space for us to protect the future for as well as the continent. Otherwise, without using this space or this CJM, everything will just perish or collapse. But all I can say for now is to thank you for the opportunity. And fortunate and luckily for me today is that the load shedding and the network gave me this opportunity. Thank you very much. We are here, we are behind, we put our hands together to make an impact out of this great tool that we have. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Phumzile, an error on my part, but can you speak a bit more in terms of the work you've been doing on the ground where you are in helping to build the CJCM and engaging with your community?
Yes, we do. I do engaging with the community, but of course there are challenges that need more of my effort and the people that I'm working with in order to make them understand clear the tool and the purpose of introducing such tool, which is from CJCM. Yeah. Can you hear me?
I can hear you clearly. Sorry, apologies. I am under load shedding, so my network is
I'm sorry.
in and out.
Yeah. What I'm saying is that we're doing some groundwork. We're working, and of course there are challenges, because one of the most important is to show the element and the important part of utilizing this tool for the change. So we do the work, and of course this report will also help a lot in the groundwork that I'm doing with the community. Thank you very much. Hello.
Thank you, Phumzile. Unfortunately, some of the other panelists are having trouble on their side, so they are unable to connect right now. So next we'll go to Ruth Vapsveld from Tax for Climate Justice to speak about the work that they've been doing at the university campus and some of the challenges and successes that they've had. Ruth, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. My connection just came up to say it's unstable, so I won't put my camera on for now. But yeah, essentially we've been trying to do a lot of mostly allowing for more conscientization of the student body to allow people to be more educated about this, because obviously the people who are students are going to be the professional workers and people, you know, in that field that would be making an impact and making decisions that would influence the climate crisis. Recently for Earth Day, we held a fundraiser and we and a movie night, and we also had a speaker come and speak to us about eco-socialism, which was quite interesting, a wonderful conversation. I think, and obviously we're quite new, so but we've gotten some really good engagement from the students so far, and it's been very encouraging to see. I think some of our biggest struggles are just dealing with bureaucracy and institutions. It's been quite complicated to ensure that we registered as a society. It's been quite an uphill battle to try and fight to allow any sort of progressive society to be registered at the university, because there's quite a bit of pushback for that. So, but we had managed, I think as far as I know so far, we have actually managed to be registered, which hopefully means that we can get funding to do more things. But yeah, we're looking forward to doing more workshops, more engagement, and hopefully more engagement with the broader Pretoria community, and allow for more awareness about climate justice, but also to help ignite a flame for this movement. So yeah, I think that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruth. Ruth is a student at the University of Pretoria, and they're a young group in terms of as a society, but they've been quite energized and active in trying to build climate justice perspectives where they are. And unfortunately, some of the comrades who were in different parts of the country, Eastern Cape and parts of the Western Cape, but we also have Malaki from Bloemfontein, who began his work or their work at as a student in the University of Free State, but has expanded to working within the greater Bloemfontein community, working on centers for people there, and initiating a drive to try to recruit 500 members from a small team. We also have young activists such as Geronimo from Cape Town, also organizing 8 schools with over 80 core activists. So the point of this panel is to discuss and to speak about the different range of people doing what they're doing, where they are, communicating these perspectives. Andre Naidu is another activist from the Western Cape who's working with religious organizations and faith communities, and Nosintu from the Eastern Cape working with children and disabled people in the rural areas of Eastern Cape. So this is just a picture of the different representation of how climate justice activists takes place on the ground and what it looks like, and that there's a range of different ways in which these perspectives are communicated and how climate justice activists on the ground are engaging with this work. So we do have a little bit of time to take some points from anyone in the chat, or if you want to raise a hand to speak about, I think this is a natural progression from our previous discussion into this, and then how do we build and what do we do to build the CJCM on the ground? How do we take these perspectives to people where they are in their communities, in their schools, in their workplaces? I see a point here from Mabu Molele, who speaks about concerns that the Presidential Climate Commission and the Just Transition Framework is focused on the energy sector, and it's about pushing interests of business. So these are some of the things that we have to contend with within the climate justice struggle, particularly in the South African context, and that in the mainstream, and in terms of where all the oxygen goes in these kind of processes of government and business, dilutes some of the points which we've had, for example, in discussions such as this of what climate justice the Charter presents or what climate justice activists requires. So how then do we expand in our communities, in our schools, in our workplaces, these perspectives, and to build the movement so that we don't have this narrow framing of what the climate justice struggle and the transition are. This is part of the process of what these kind of engagements are about. And for us to also think around in terms of how we continue to do this activism. Sorry, I'm having communication challenges and my network is cutting because my load shedding has not ended. I see Janet has a hand up. I just want to know, Janet, is that an old or a new hand?
Sorry. Sorry, it was an old hand. Did you hear me?
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that, I wondered.
No problem. So we are running over time. I'd like to hand over to Bishop Charles for the closing, and apologies once again for my connection.
Charles, do you want to just make any concluding comments or highlight certain things, and we can wrap up?
No, Vish, I was just following through with the point raised by Patrick on the polluter pays principle. Just to say, Patrick, really looking forward to your feedback on the policy on how we can include this in the rights of nature policy as part of dealing with the decarbonization of ESCOM, because it's a huge issue. And it's unfair that we, the people, have to pay for the same pollution that we are being victims of. So, Patrick, looking forward to your feedback on the policy. Thank you.
Thank you. So, one of the take homes we'd like you to grapple with is that the rich way of life is really the problem. Living like wealthy societies, living like wealthy people is definitely not emancipation. It is not what we should be striving for. It embodies in it all the contradictions, all the problems, all the crisis tendencies that we now all have to grapple with. So we, as I said, we have to really think about everything. We have to think about new ways of living and being in nature, in earth relations, and so on. And that means we're going to have some very, very hard conversations. And we are kicking that off. The Charter, as everybody has been saying, is a plurivision to address the legacies of apartheid, but not to become like a black bourgeoisie. We want to address the current crisis, but again, not in a tinkering, technocratic management way. We want to deal with it in a transformative way. And we want to build a different kind of future, a future in which we can survive, we can thrive, there's justice, and it's... Now, we really want you to also come on board to work with us. There's a lot of work to do around policy, translating the 14 systemic alternatives in the Charter into policies. At the back end of the CJCM webpage, we have working groups. We're now going to be activating them. So we're formally announcing that today to invite you to co-create these policies with us, to work with us to figure out these very complex and big issues. We also want to invite you to take back the documents, take back the conference report, take back the first policy we've produced around the rights of nature and natural climate solutions. That document is a draft document. It's for public engagement. Please take it into your community organizations, student organizations, your networks, your family circles, etc., and start talking about these things. We welcome your feedback. We don't have everything figured out. We don't have all the answers. And so we really, really would appreciate your comments, your input, and so on. You have till August 28th to engage with this. In addition, from now till October, 16th to 19th, when we're having the next CJCM conference, there's going to be various activities. On the 4th of May, we'll be having our last in our seminar series on sort of fixing Eskom and accelerating the just energy transition. We've definitely have tried to position that conversation contra the way the Presidential Climate Commission approaches the energy system and transition. We'll have a great panel. We'll have Dinga Sikwebu, who's a long-standing trade unionist, one of the pioneers of the concept of socially owned renewable energy speaking. We'll have Julia May from Wits University, who's done research on renewable energy projects in the country. And we are planning to have a solar engineer on the panel to empower us around what's happening to solar technologies today. What is the frontier of renewables? What's happening to batteries? What's happening to solar panels and inverters and things like that, microgrids, etc. So that's on the 4th of May. The poster will come out shortly. On the 18th of May, we are having an assembly with, it's an assembly of trade unions and workers. We are inviting all the key unions, the federations in the country, including key affiliates, to share with us their approach to the just transition, the challenges they have, and how they envisage the way forward. Also just inviting ordinary workers to come to talk about their concerns and their fears. And we will, in that meeting, also share the work we are doing and discuss how we partner with the labor movement in the country. On June 16th, we are going to be having a Youth Day assembly. The big physical assembly will be at Wits University, but we are inviting youth across the country to be part of the online assembly. The headline banner for that is "The next youth struggle is the climate justice struggle. Build the CJCM now." We'll be launching a book at that assembly around People's and Workers' Climate Justice Charter Futures, Accelerate the Just Transition Now. We'll also be grappling with issues of intergenerational justice in that assembly, and how do we accelerate the just transition to advance the interests of young people. In August, we will be having a feminist assembly. On August 9th, we'll be having some leading eco-feminists in the country speak on that panel, including Ariel Salah from Australia, one of the leading eco-feminists in the world. And they'll be talking about what is the role climate justice struggle. We'll also be launching a book on emancipatory feminism, and also we'll be discussing how we build the CJCM through a conscious feminist practice. So that's August, and then of course we'll probably launch a few policies again in July and in September. It's done, and of course we're culminating this in the October conference, 16th to 19th. Of October, and we'd really like to ensure that we reach that conference with about 10,000 members minimum. We have to have a mass base. We can't launch a movement to transform this entire country just with a few hundred members. So today we're also inviting you to rise to the challenge with us. Please recruit your friends, recruit your neighbors, recruit your family members, convene CJCM forums of individuals and organizations. Get them onto our webpage to participate in groups, draw down the tools we've developed to accelerate the just transition, have workshops, empower, raise consciousness, institutionalize, and let's take this movement forward. Thank you for time today and for celebrating Earth Day. Take care, comrades.